for inviting me out, and thanks for all of you for coming. All right, so what's the relationship between thinking philosophically about moral issues and living one's life? That's, I think, an interesting question. Lots of people, I think almost every philosopher, and probably lots of non-philosophers, have opinions about that, actually. But very little work has been done on it systematically, empirically. In fact, as far as I know, all of the work that's been done on it has been done by Josh Rust and me. So to fix ideas in thinking about the relationship between philosophical moral reflection and real-world moral behavior, it's helpful to have, I think, some models in the background of what might the relationship be. So here are 4 models to think about. One we call the booster model. On the booster model, when you engage in philosophical moral reflection, when you study Kant and Hume and Plato, Aristotle and Bernard Williams, you discover moral truths. You might discover general moral truths, like, say, that people should donate large amounts of their money to charity rather than living extravagant, wealthy lifestyles. Or you might discover specific moral truths, like this particular type of behavior is sexist and wrong. Or you might have generally been opposed to sexism, but you might not have thought about that particular type of behavior before. But one way or another, thinking about philosophical issues, thinking philosophically, applying tools as a professional philosopher or as a student of philosophy will help you discover moral truths of some sort or other. And then you put those truths into action. So now you say, donate more to charity than you otherwise would have, or you avoid that sexist behavior that you might otherwise have engaged in. So your moral behavior improves as a result of your reflection. And let's throw in one more good thing. This is the all good things view. It increases the consistency between your attitude and behavior, right? So think about the sexism case, right? Most people will say, well, sexism is bad, but they might engage in a lot of sexist behavior. Right? Once you start thinking philosophically, you might say, oh, well, that would be sexist, and that would be sexist, and now there's more consistency between your general espoused opinions and your behavior as you live it in their day-to-day life. So that's the booster view, right? You learn more moral truths, you behave better, and there's higher consistency between your expressed or attitudes and your actual lived behavior. Here's another possible view. This is the epiphenomenalist view. This is the nothing at all happens view. On this view, philosophical moral reflection has no impact whatsoever on your moral opinions, on your real-world behavior, or on the consistency between your opinions and behavior. You basically just have the same opinions you always would have had. Maybe now you can decorate them with little frilly arguments. And you behave the way that you always used to, and maybe you can decorate that with little frilly arguments too, but nothing changes. That's the epiphenomenalist view. A third view is, I'll call a rationalization view, using the term rationalization in the pejorative sense, like when you rationalize bad behavior. On the rationalization view, philosophical moral reflection increases the consistency between your attitudes and your behavior. But it does it in the opposite causal direction than on the booster view. On the booster view, you discover the moral truth and then you put it into action. On the rationalization view, you see how you're acting, and you're like, yeah, that's right, that's how one should act. Or maybe you see how you're inclined to act or how you're tempted to act, and then you create a story behind it, right? So your views shift, your attitudes shift to match your existing behavior or your behavioral inclinations. This seems to introduce some self-serving noise into your reflection about morality, so you might think this would tend to lead you away from moral truths. I'm assuming, by the way, that there are moral truths. I think all of this stuff can make sense and be interesting if you bracketing that assumption in metaethics, and we can talk about that if you want. But for simplicity, I'm just assuming there are moral truths. And then there are 2 versions of this. The inert rationalization and the toxic rationalization. So on inert rationalization, your behavior is just the same as it always was. right? So now you've shifted your moral attitudes in a self-serving, self-flattering way to match how you always have behaved and continue to behave. That's the inert rationalization view. On the toxic rationalization view, what happens is you justify immoral tendencies toward which you were initially attracted, but which you would have refrained from had you not engaged in philosophical moral reflection. So for example, let's say that there's a library book, you're tempted to steal it. Right? Now normally you wouldn't have stolen a library book, that's just not the kind of thing you do, but then you think, well, John Stuart Mill says maximize utility, and if I think about it, this maximizes utility, right? And then you steal the book, and you wouldn't have if you hadn't had that philosophical training. And I'm assuming that stealing books is bad, right? You're not actually maximizing utility or doing what's morally right? You've just created this paper rationalization, which now licenses morally worse behavior than you would have engaged in if you hadn't had philosophical training at all. That's the toxic rationalization view. And then finally, fourth view I'll call the inert discovery view. On this view, philosophical moral reflection leads you to discover moral truths, but it does not have any effect on your personal behavior. So you discover, say, oh, well, eating meat is bad, and then you go have a cheeseburger. Or you discover, well, this behavior would be sexist, and then you go and do it anyway. You might think on a view like this, the attitude and behavior consistency would decline, right? Because you might start with, kind of normal, flattering attitudes, and you discover that there are all these demands on you that you might not otherwise would have expected, but you're just behaving the same anyway. So now maybe there's a little disconnect between your attitudes and your behavior. All right, so those are 4 different possible models we can have in the background to think about what the possible relationship might be between philosophical moral reflection and real-world moral behavior. Now, before getting into the empirical data, I'm going to tell you, oh, sorry, forgot this part. You could also have a toxic discovery, a toxic version of the discovery view. So you might, for example, discover that morality is overrated. You might read Nietzsche and think, this is just cartoon Nietzsche, this is maybe not real Nietzsche, but you might read Nietzsche and think, yeah, morality is bunk, let's go murder people. All right, so this did happen in a Hitchcock movie, but... all right, so I think we can test these models in part by looking at the actual behavior of professional ethicists. And I do that with 2 working assumptions in the background. Both of these I think are questionable, and so if you're inclined to question them, we can think about that later and come back to that later, but I'm just going to assume both of these for the time being. One is that ethicists engage in philosophical moral reflection more often than, and at least as well as, other professors do. They've thought more about, for example, whether we have moral duties to refrain from eating meat, how much people should give to charity, whether there's a moral duty to vote, and stuff like that. On average, the average ethicist has thought more about those issues, and at least as well about those issues as other professors. And ethicists are similar in other dimensions. So with those 2 working assumptions in the background, we can make some predictions based on the models about the actual behavior of professional ethicists. So the booster model will predict that ethicists behave better, right? They've done more philosophical reflection, they've discovered the truths, they put those truths into action. You have a phenomenalist, of course, predicts nothing, that ethicists will behave the same, and so do the inert views, predict no changes in behavior. And the toxic views predict that ethicists will behave worse than other comparison groups. The booster view and the inert discovery view both predict that ethicists will have more moral views that are closer to the moral truth, whatever the moral truth is. So if the moral truth is that you should donate lots to charity, then ethicists will tend to have views closer to that than comparison groups will. Epiphenomenalist predicts the same as always, and rationalization view maybe predicts that ethicists would drift away from the truth as they engage in self-serving rationalizations to justify their immoral inclinations. And And then finally, attitude behavior consistency. The booster and the rationalization views both predict higher attitude behavior consistency for professional ethicists than for other groups. They do it for different causal reasons, right? The booster thinks you match your behavior to shape, you shape your behavior to match your attitudes. The rationalization view predicts that you shape your attitudes to match your behavior, but they both predict increased attitude behavior consistency. Epiphenomenalist, as always, predicts the same. The inert discovery model maybe predicts lower attitude behavior consistency. So those are 4 models. And those are some sets of predictions derived from those models about the actual behavior of ethicists. And the rest of this talk, until we get to the final slide, is going to be all empirical. So I don't know if you guys feel like tossing out questions about the setup or whether we should just keep rolling. I guess if there are clarification questions, maybe good to get them out now. Yeah?
Just a quick question. Under ethicist attitudes, you say under inert discovery that you predict the same. I thought we need for inert discovery that it be closer to truth.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah, no, that's a semicolon. Closer to truth, booster, inert discovery.
Ah, yeah, sorry.
So it's a little, I was trying to get this all in one slide, and maybe I packed a little too dense. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. So here's the first study. Almost all of these studies are collaborative with Josh Rust. We went to the Pacific Division meeting of the American Philosophical Association in 2007. And we just did an opinion survey there. It had 2 versions. Well, what we did was we set up a table, and the table said, complete a 5-minute philosophical scientific questionnaire, receive 4 Ghirardelli chocolate squares. And then the people completed those questionnaires on the spot. We had almost no participants refuse to complete the questionnaire once they saw what it was. We did have one person storm off and say that this questionnaire was unethical. We also had one famous ethicist who stole chocolate. So we had this questionnaire, they sat down, they took it. The key questions were these 2. Do ethicists, so we asked them, take a moment to consider the various ethics professors you've known, both as colleagues and in the student-mentor relationship. As best you can determine from your own experience, do professors specializing in ethics tend on average to behave morally better, worse, or about the same as philosophers not specializing in ethics? And then we gave them a 7-point scale from substantially morally better, marked 1, through about the same, marked 4, to substantially morally worse, marked 7. And then we asked a similar question with a comparison group being, instead of being philosophers not specializing in ethics, the comparison group was non-academics of a similar social background. So this is just an opinion survey asking people's general opinion about the behavior of their colleagues. And we had comparison questions asking about specialists in metaphysics and epistemology. So we asked, in your experience, do specialists in metaphysics and epistemology tend to behave morally better, worse, or about the same as other philosophers? Morally better, worse, or about the same as non-academics of similar social background. So here's what we found. You don't need to pay attention to all of these numbers, but the basic finding is similar. If you look at the ethicist respondents, they tend to split for both comparison groups versus other philosophers and versus non-academics. They tend to split between saying that ethicists behave better and saying they behave about the same. And not too many say that ethicists behave on average worse. If you look at the non-ethicist philosophers respondents, right, so we asked whether they were ethicists, given several choices at the end of the questionnaire. They split about equally between better, same, and worse. So opinion in 2007, at least in San Francisco, under the influence of chocolate, was split. But there's certainly not a majority of people saying that ethicists behave on average better. Now, we were concerned that people might answer based on, say, the availability of a particular sample ethicist who might stand out for particularly morally good or morally bad behavior, or based on some general theory they have, or based on an appreciation of irony, or who knows. So we also asked we had a second version of the questionnaire, which half of the recipients got. We just interleaved them so that people would get alternate versions. We asked them to consider the ethicist in your department whose name comes next after yours in alphabetical order, looping around from Z to A if necessary, and compare the moral behavior of that specific individual to the moral behavior of non-ethicists in your department and non-academics of similar social background. We asked respondents who did not have an ethicist in their department to consider the ethicist meeting these criteria in their graduate department. And here we found, we gave them a similar 1 to 7 scale. We asked, again, similar comparison questions about specialists in metaphysics and epistemology. And we found basically similar results. Whoops. What we found was that people's opinions were split. So the non-ethicist philosophers split between rating the ethicist better than they rated the M&E specialist, rating the M&E specialist better than they rated the ethicist, or rating them about the same. Ethicists tended to skew toward rating the other ethicists better, but not by a wide margin. So the next study I did, so when I was doing this study, a lot of people said, well, you know, this is interesting. I've noticed that ethics books seem to be missing from academic libraries a lot. I'm like, well, we could look at that. So what I did was I looked at books reviewed in the Philosophical Review, which is the leading venue for book reviews. Books were reviewed in Philosophical Review from 1990 to 2001. I excluded any of the kind of old classic books. Sometimes old classic books, when they come out in new editions, get re-reviewed, like Theory of Justice, Rawls's Theory of Justice. So I excluded any books that were originally published before 1985, and I also excluded books that have appeared at least 5 times in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a standard resource in philosophy for review discussions, and books that appear 5 times or more in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy are well-known books, classics, the kinds of things that, you know, advanced undergrads might read. Rawls, Mill, Williams, those kinds of books that lots of people know. I wanted to focus on obscure books. So I'm looking. So that's excluding the books that were cited 5 times in the Stanford Encyclopedia is a way of limiting it to obscure books that only specialists would be likely to check out from the library. So, for example, the first 5 non-ethics books on the list were Bob Hale, Abstract Objects, Herbert A. Davidson, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes on Intellect, PMS Hacker, Appearance and Reality, etc. Those kinds of things that no one would have heard of unless they're a serious student or professor of philosophy. And then I looked at the rates at which they were missing from leading academic libraries in the United States and Britain. Looked at about 30 libraries total. I selected libraries basically by 2 criteria. One was, did they have a lot of holdings? And the second was, did they make the checkout status readily available online? So, for example, Harvard and Oxford with have huge holdings, and you could just go and see if the books on the shelf were checked out. I also did a comparison study where I looked at classic pre-20th century texts in US libraries. So I looked at, for example, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, a non-ethics text. I looked at Mill's On Liberty, an ethics text. So here's what we found for the obscure contemporary books. So we had similar numbers of titles in each group. Actually, for the non-ethicist books, I only used a third of the sample, so I just randomly selected a third of them. This is the holdings. So we had about 30 libraries. So we had a little bit more than 1 title per, one copy per library. Similar checkout rates, 6.2, 6.1, off shelf. Books that were either missing or listed as more than 1 year overdue, you start to see the split. And that split is statistically significant. We can express this as a risk ratio. So the missing is a percentage of the books that are off the shelf, where off the shelf just means checked out or missing. ethics was 8.5% of the books, non-ethics was 5.7% of the books. The risk ratio is 1.48 to 1, significant by to proportion Z test. For the classic pre-20th century texts, which I assume would be mostly checked out by students, although presumably professors would also check these out sometimes. The risk ratio, the odds ratio was about 2 to 1, and was highly statistically significant. So the single most missing book was Mill's Utilitarianism. Like 30% of the copies that were off the shelf were missing. All right, so this is the main result. This is one of the two first studies, right? And but it's the main result that comes out negatively for ethicists. Most of the results come out with a no detectable difference. So this is one of them. So what we did was some US states make voting records readily available to researchers and journalists. We don't know how people voted, but we just know whether they voted in particular elections. So what we did was we looked at faculty lists at universities, and then we looked for registered voters within 50 or 60 miles of that university, and then we did name matches, we excluded people with common names, and we looked at the rate at which those people voted. And what we found was, and we looked at ethicists, and then we broke out political philosophers as a subgroup of ethicists. We looked at non-ethicist philosophers, we looked at political scientists, and we looked at a comparison group of other professors at the same universities, and we just looked at how often did they vote, right? So the background assumption here, shared actually by most people we interviewed, we asked these questions of in a survey later, which I'll talk about in a bit. On the assumption that it's morally better to vote in public elections than not to vote, or that voting is a duty, you see all these groups voting at similar rates, except for political scientists, who voted about 10 to 15% more often than the other groups did. So we didn't see ethicists being more likely to execute this particular civic duty. We didn't see political philosophers being more likely than other professors to do this civic duty. And also, interestingly to us, the variance was identical among the groups. So one thing that I had thought would happen would be, especially for the political scientists, that you get some people who are real enthusiasts for voting, who say you got to vote in every election, right? We found these students on one website that had a T-shirt that said "Vote or Die" on one of the websites for political science, right? That's like, yeah, you might have those people might be overrepresented in political science departments, right? And likewise, you might have some people who in political science departments who are, well, voting's irrational or the system's corrupt. There's no point, right? So if you had scoffers and enthusiasts overrepresented among political philosophers or among political scientists, then you would expect a higher variance in vote rate. But we didn't find that. We found identical variance among all the groups. All right. We also think that there's a defeasible, at least, duty to respond to emails from undergraduates. Most undergraduates share that view. We sent 3 fictional emails to hundreds of professors. This one did squeak through the IRB. And then we just looked for whether we got a response of any sort other than just an automated kind of "I'm not around" response. The email 3 was the one that got the highest response rate, and I'll just read you that email. It was from Katie Sanchez, and it said, "Dear Professor," and then we inserted the name of the professor. "I was planning to take your fall course," then we inserted the name of a course, the lowest level course that the professor was scheduled to teach that coming fall. This was sent out during the summer. "I was planning to take your fall course. However, due to some unavoidable family obligations, I will not be able to attend the first or 2 or possibly 3 class meetings. But the course sounds interesting. I'm a good student with a 3.6 GPA, and I'm willing to put in a little extra work to get up to speed. Do you think it would be possible to succeed in your class despite those missed days, or should I register for a different class? Thanks for your time in responding to this, Katie Sanchez." If the professor was not scheduled to teach a course that term, we had an alternative email about a friend recommending that person as a teacher and asking if there was a lower division class that they would be teaching in the coming year. So these are the response rates. As you can see here, for 2 of the emails, the ethicists did seem to have the highest response rates, but that was not statistically detectable. All of the variation was well within statistical chance, despite the fact, I'm slightly embarrassed to say, that we had 3,000 total trials. So that's the email study. Now, let me mention that we had self-reports about responsiveness, because we also sent out, many of the recipients of this were also participants in a survey study that we did. So we sent survey questionnaires to professional ethicists, philosophers in the same departments who didn't specialize in ethics, and a comparison group of other professors at the same university. They all got a questionnaire from us inviting them to participate in this survey about professors' moral attitudes and behavior. We had up to 5 contacts with each individual. We got a 60% response rate. These questions, the questions we had in the survey, in the first part of the survey, we asked people's moral opinions about various normative issues. In the second part of the survey, we asked them to self-report their own behavior on those same issues. And then, for some measures, we also had direct observational measures of their behavior. So we could compare self-reported attitudes, self-reported behavior, and measured behavior in a kind of a 3-way comparison. So here's how it worked for the email. We had 2 email-related questions on the survey. We asked them to rate the morality of not consistently responding to student emails on a 9-point scale from very morally bad through neutral to very morally good. There weren't many who selected that option. And then in the second part of the survey, where people were reporting their own behavior, we asked about what percentage of student emails do you respond to, and we followed that by a blank where they could enter a percentage. "51% of our respondents claimed to respond to 100% of student emails, and 93% of our respondents claimed to respond to at least 90% of student emails. All 3 groups had similar self-reports, which were not statistically detectably different. Those who claimed at least 98% responsiveness were somewhat more likely to have responded to the emails, but the relationship wasn't strong. Those claiming at least 98% responsiveness responded to 64% of the emails we sent, versus 57% response rate among those who claimed lower than 98% responsiveness. The correlation between self-reported responsiveness and observed responsiveness was R equals 0.16, which means 3% of the variance in responsiveness could be explained by self-report. For ethicists, the R was 0.12, 1% of the variance in responsiveness could be explained by differences in self-report. "83% of our respondents rated not consistently responding to student emails on the morally bad side of our scale, right? So anywhere from 1 to 4 was morally bad, 5 was neutral, 6 to 9 was morally good. The groups did not detectably differ. Among the survey respondents who received all 3 of our emails, the average number of emails responded to, if they said it was bad not to respond, it's going to be in this column. If they said, it's not bad not to respond, it's neutral, or a few even said it was good not to respond. For ethicists, no difference. For philosophers not specializing in ethics, non-significant trend toward actually being more likely to respond if they said it was not bad not to respond, right? The one saying it's neutral, saying, being more likely to respond. And the only sensible people were the non-philosophers who did show a statistically significant tendency to be more likely to respond if they said it was bad not to respond and if they did not say it was bad, not to respond. You got all of the negatives in your mind? I know that's a few double negatives in there, but hopefully it's clear enough.
Sorry, just to give them the benefit of the doubt, you sure it didn't go into their spam box or the ones who...
So we had, we have over 90% of our respondents contacted us in one way or another, either through responding to one of the emails or through responding to our, actually, no, sorry, so that's irrelevant actually, because these are, we're talking about survey respondents here. So yeah, so for the address for the survey study is not the same as the address from which they're receiving these messages. So we checked the messages against spam filters. We checked them against the spam filters at UCR, at Stetson University where my collaborator works, spam filters at Gmail and at Yahoo, and they got through tests, those spam tests there, but we don't know more than that. We sent them out in batches of, I think, 100, so we didn't get caught sending huge amounts all at once. Right. It doesn't seem especially likely that any of the participants, any of the groups would differ in the quality or nature of their spam filters. So if whatever percentage was being captured, hopefully is not going to be confounded with the variable that we're attempting to measure. All right, in the same survey, if I'm a little nearsighted, so if you got your hand up for a question, I'm totally game for you to interrupt me, but just wave it high or maybe make monkey noises or something. All right, so in the same survey, we asked about what percentage of income should the typical professor donate to charity? We also said enter 0 in parentheses after that. We said enter 0 if you think it's not the case that the typical professor should donate to charity. Here we found ethicists expressing more stringent normative views than the other professors. So the geometric mean, excluding the zeros, was 5.9 for the ethicists versus 4.8% for the other groups. Percentage entering 0 was about 25% for the two other groups. Only 9% of ethicists entered 0, expressing that the other professors did not have an obligation to donate to charity. So more stringent normative views about charitable giving among ethicists. This survey was conducted in early 2009. I guess it's not forthcoming anymore. It came out in 2014. It took a while for it to get through full site. Self-reported percentage of 2008 income donated to charity. Here we see a result that's not predicted by any of the models, which is that ethicists and non-philosophers reported having given more to charity than the non-ethicist philosophers. Percentage reporting 0, we got a statistically marginal effect by the chi-square, with ethicists being less likely, maybe, to report having given nothing to charity. Normative attitude and self-described behavior were pretty well correlated by social science standards. The correlation was 0.44. Right, so what percentage did the typical professor give correlated with what percentage did I give? Correlation was similar. I forget whether that's log adjusted. I think maybe not, but it was similar whether we did it log adjusted or not. But interestingly, the groups differed substantially in the correlation. Right, so the non-philosophers showed a pretty high correlation between what they said the typical professor should give and what they reported having given themselves. Whereas the ethicists showed a substantially lower correlation, and the non-ethicist philosophers were in the middle. Now, I haven't mentioned this so far, but half of the questionnaires included a charity incentive to respond. We would give $10 to respondents' selected charity among 6. The 6 that we offered were Oxfam America, Red Cross, CARE, Doctors Without Borders, Make-A-Wish, and World Wildlife Fund. We served maybe 15 minutes, 10 minutes to fill out the survey. we'll give $10 to one of these charities if you do it. We hope that this would increase response rates and also give us a dependent measure of charitable motivation. So it had two purposes. Unfortunately, the charity incentive made little difference, right? So the response rate without the incentive was 60%, with the incentive was 60%, without the incentive was 56%. Statistically marginal. And for the ethicists, was spot on, no difference whatsoever. And the only group that showed a statistically significant difference between their response rate with and without the charity incentive was the non-ethicist philosophers, who were the ones who self-described having given the least to charity. So, I'm not quite sure exactly what to make of these charity results, but so this is the message that I take. That at least there's not evidence here that ethicists are more charitable. So they seem to have, or they express at least, more stringent normative views about how much you should give to charity. By the self-report measure, maybe they're better than non-ethicist philosophers, they're not better than other professors. By our one behavioral measure, though it's a somewhat weak measure, right, they don't seem to be as good as other philosophers, so not quite sure what to draw, but not a big win for ethicists, at least. Here. Same survey. One of the normative questions we had was regularly eating the meat of mammals, such as beef or pork. So the percentage rating that on the morally bad side of the 9-point scale, 60% of the ethicists did, 45% of the non-ethicist philosophers, and only 19% of the non-philosophers. So this is a huge difference. We also found big differences by gender and by age. So women were substantially more likely to say it was bad than men, and people born 1960 or later were substantially more likely to say it was bad than people born 1960 or earlier. And in fact, these differences kind of stacked. So if you compare female philosophers born 1960 or after, I think, with male non-philosophers born 1959 or before, there's a huge difference of opinion. It was like 81% versus 7% or something like that. Giant, right? So like think about, when was the last time you saw a Gallup survey where based on a few demographic variables you got that huge difference in opinion? I mean, this is a giant difference in opinion. But we did not find any difference in self-reported behavior when we asked, did you eat the meat of a mammal at your last evening meal, not including snacks? All right, so here it is for ethicists, for our main intended planned comparison between ethicists, other philosophers, and non-philosophers. You'll see ethicists are not even in the lowest group here. Statistically marginal difference. So so maybe there is a little bit of a tendency for philosophers to report having eaten less meat than non-philosophers, but maybe not. Maybe there's a little effect. We're certainly not detecting a big effect. Certainly nothing like the difference in attitude. Yeah?
I just have a question. Why is it just beef or pork?
We debated a lot about exactly how to phrase this question. We wanted something that was simple. And we tried, like, factory farmed animals and blah, blah, blah. So there's all kinds of ways you could do this. But we wanted something simple, and we wanted something that would capture the weak form of vegetarianism, right? So there, I think, are a lot of people who think that it's okay to eat, say, chicken and fish, but not okay to eat beef and pork, right? So we wanted to do something that would not confuse that issue, right? So if you said, is it bad to eat meat? And someone thinks, oh, well, I think it's bad to eat pork and beef, but not bad to eat chicken and fish, then they would be confused by that question, whereas this question hopefully is less confusing. And also more likely to get, at least some agreement from non-philosophers. Same survey, percentage rating, blood donation, regularly donating blood on the good side of our scale. We gave the same 9-point scale for almost all of the questions. Here again, we see ethicists with the most stringent expressed views, right? So on charity, on vegetarianism, on organ donation, and blood donation, all of them, they have the most stringent expressed views. It's not nearly as big a difference as in the vegetarianism case, but still, look, it's the same pattern with ethicists to have the most demanding view, non-philosophers the least demanding, Other philosophers in the middle, and statistically significant by the chi-square, same pattern, with the percentage rating not having an organ donor symbol on your driver's license. Right, so this is a bad, this tests the bad side of the scale, this tests the good side of the scale. We wanted to phrase this negatively so that we can capture the bad side of the scale. Let's look at the behavior. Percentage reporting having donated blood in the past 15 months. No detectable difference. Percentage reporting having an organ donor symbol on their driver's license. No detectable difference. Four grad students and I, three grad students, Josh Rust and I, went to meetings of the American Philosophical Association. We went to 4 different meetings from 2008 to 2009, and we coded various kinds of courteous and discourteous behavior in ethics sessions and in non-ethics sessions to see if there was any difference in audience behavior. So one of our measures was, did members of the audience talk audibly during the formal presentation, right? So the coder would sit in the back of the room, and if you saw someone talking but you didn't hear them, we didn't code it. If someone said something polite like thank you for a handout, we didn't code it. But if the person said something that was audible, the speaker was actually speaking at the time, and it was not just a polite thank you, then, or similar, then we coded it. And here we found no statistical difference between the groups. Not a very high rate of talking, by the way. This is 0.1 instances per audience hour. Now, I think we substantially under-coded talking because people in the front who were talking might not be heard from the back. But anyway, that was our measure. We didn't see any difference between the groups. We also looked at door slamming, right? So you come in late, you leave early. Do you let the door bang closed and distract the people who are in the room possibly? Or do you make some effort, any effort, whether effectual or not, to close the door more quietly? We called that a door slam. And we ended up having to do non-parametrics on this because there were a few sessions that just had tons of slamming and were not statistically independent from the other sessions. So we did median door slams per session, and there we found no detectable difference. We also looked at the percentage of audience who left behind cups or trash. And here we had lots of data points. So people who left behind cups, we called cups anything that was a non-disposable container. So like at these meetings, sometimes you get a glass cup for water, or you get a coffee mug, that's a cup. Right? Someone leaves behind that, they left behind a cup. If they leave behind anything else, like a disposable coffee mug, or breakfast wrapper, or candy wrapper, we coded anything that was at least the size of a candy wrapper as a piece of trash. This is a little speck we would code. So cups, no difference between the ethics sessions and the non-ethics sessions. Trash, no difference between the ethics sessions and the non-ethics sessions. If you ever walked into one of these trash rooms in an APA, you'll know what I'm talking about. Like the afternoon session, you come in, there's like people's crap is everywhere. I don't know. You might not find that disgusting. Here's our break point for environmental ethics. Participants in environmental ethics sessions left behind less trash than the other groups. That's the one thing we found where ethicists show better than anyone else. All right. Percentage of philosophers appearing on Pacific APA main program from 2006 to 2008 who paid their meeting registration fees. Let me tell you a little bit of the backstory on this, right? So it used to be the case that it was an honor system, right? So the American Philosophical Association would distribute the program. The program would have all the rooms listed on it. You're supposed to show up. You're supposed to pay your registration fees. But you get the program. The program's freely available to everyone, and it's an honor system to pay your registration fees. That started collapsing in the 2000s when the APA started to get the impression that lots of people weren't paying their registration fees. So now, in order to get the program, the version of the program that has the rooms on it, you have to pay your registration fees first, because the honor system collapsed because it's too much free writing. So we went to the APA, and the Pacific Division was nice to us. The other divisions weren't nice to us. The Pacific Division cooperated with us. The other, they were perfectly nice. They just declined to cooperate. The Pacific Division said, okay, yeah, you can look at some of our data. So what we did was, we needed to like spy encrypted, and like we had someone who was associated with a different center on campus who had no idea what the data were about, coding it. Anyway, we did this really complex spy like coding procedure. We figured and the aim of the procedure was to match the list of people who paid their registration fees with a list of people who appeared on the program. Were the people who were on the program, had they paid their registration fees during this period during which the honor system was collapsing? And then we coded the ethics sessions versus the non-ethics sessions. So what we found was, again, no difference. 74% of the ethicists on the program had paid their registration fees, 76% of the non-ethicists. And these results survived examination for confounds by sex, student status, role in the program, and institutional prestige. Now you're probably thinking, though, what about the Nazis? Because this is, after all, an ethics talk. So you might say, well, look, these behaviors are kind of trivial, right? This is, I call this the grand wisdom hypothesis. The grand wisdom hypothesis is, well, look, ethicists might not respond to student emails, they might not pay the registration fees, they might like eat a cheeseburger once in a while, but that's all little stuff. When it comes to big stuff like, did you join the Nazi party and kick the Jews out of your university, on those kinds of issues, ethicists are going to be better. Now you might be thinking of a certain counterexample, but that's just one data point whose name starts with H. I found this wonderful book by George Lehman, published in 1993, where he has mini biographies, about 1/2 page, of every single philosopher employed within Germany during the entire Nazi period. And they show what religion the person was, what a few selected works, and whether the person was involved in Nazism, what Nazi party, what society memberships they might have had, also whether they were punished by the Nazis in any way, for example, by having their work forbidden or being forced to flee the country, or even 2 of them were killed by the Nazis. So I took this group and I excluded all the Jews. I didn't have much choice. And I only looked at the people who had habilitation, which is kind of roughly the level of tenure, who had habilitation as of 1932, before Hitler came to power. Looking at those people, we got 141 philosophers. Now, they're harder to divide into ethicists versus non-ethicists in the period. I haven't tried to do that. I might do that in follow-up. But so we're looking at philosophers. In a lot of these cases, I think the sociological distinction between ethicist and non-ethicist that is now common in Anglophone universities is not as sharp in those days. If you think about Heidegger being an example, right? He wrote, in a way, he's not really exactly a canonical ethicist, but on the other hand, he talked about, how you should live your life, right? So looking at those people, 41% of those individuals joined the Nazi Party, the SA, or the SS. It was not easy to join the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party made it very difficult to join after they came into power. They didn't want a bunch of bandwagon riders joining. So you actually had to do quite a bit and really convince them that you were sincere to join the Nazi Party. 22%, 31, were severely punished non-Nazis. For example, they might have been forbidden to teach, they might have been forced to flee the country, or killed. And 37% were coasters. They were in either category. They were not severely punished in any way, but they also didn't join the Nazi Party, the SA, or the SS. Among university faculty in general, membership in the Nazi Party during this period is about 20 to 25%. So now the pressures on philosophers might be somewhat different than the pressures on people in other disciplines. So I don't know that we should conclude that the philosophers were worse. However, there was Nazi biology, Nazi anthropology, Nazi physics. There definitely were at least some pressures on most academic disciplines. Another thing we don't know from these data was what percentage of these people in other departments were severely punished. It could have been philosophers were both more likely to be punished and more likely to join the Nazi Party, a kind of bimodal distribution. Don't know that. So I'd like to, at some point, collaborate with someone who's an expert on this period and really get this straightened out, but I'm not an expert on the period, so I'm going to leave it with that. Let me summarize a little more some other behavioral data. We asked, when was the last time you called your mom? We excluded people who reported having deceased parents, deceased mothers. On that measure, the non-philosophers reported having most recently called their moms. We also asked, well, we also had various measures of honesty in survey responses, right? So remember, like for the voting data, we had both measurements of those individuals' voting patterns and their self-reports about voting. We had various other measures of honesty in the survey. We found the socially desirable responding bias to be similar among the groups. Across the survey, groups' attitude behavioral consistency was similar. Ethicists had the highest attitude behavioral consistency for voting, the lowest, as I reported on an earlier slide, for self-reported charity. We had various ways of summarizing the data. The summary measures show no statistical difference with ethicists in the middle group. We have a summary measure both for the survey study with its 9 different dependent measures, 10 different dependent measures, and we also have now a meta-analysis that looks at all of our studies, including studies that are not included in this analysis in the survey study, like the courteous behavior study and the ethics book study. None of them find anything close to a statistically significant tendency for ethicists to behave better or worse. We also have some data on student charity at Zurich and University of Washington. What we found there was, so at both of those universities, when you register for classes, you can choose to tick a box and donate a few dollars or a few euros to charities. The charities at Zurich there was one for foreign students and one for poor students. We looked at whether the students donated to either of the charities. I think at Washington, the charities shifted a little bit. There were 2 or 3. What we found was philosophers, among all the students, philosophers were among the most likely. At Zurich, they were the most likely to have donated to a charity among all of the majors that had large numbers of students. But they did not increase their donation rates across the course of their study. All right, so let's go back to the models. This is the final slide. So if we accept the background assumptions of the study, it seems not to fit very well with the booster model. Right, the booster model predicts that ethicists will behave better overall than the comparison groups, and that does not seem to be the case. If we accept the background assumptions of the study, this also doesn't go so well for the epiphenomenalist model. Ethicists seem to have more stringent moral views on some issues, like charity, vegetarianism, and organ and blood donation. Now, you could save either of these views by rejecting background assumptions, right? So you can save the booster view by saying something like, well, maybe ethicists start out worse and then use professional ethics to help improve themselves up to average. I actually don't think that's totally preposterous. So here's how something like that might go. You might think, well, look, some people just don't have very strong moral intuitions, right? Some people, they're like, they look around and all these people have these strong moral opinions about all these things. They're like, what the heck is all that, right? And among those people, maybe they don't have very strong moral emotions, very strong moral opinions for whatever reason, right? They think, well, what is this stuff? Maybe if they're especially intellectually inclined, they might be drawn into this study of this curious phenomenon. Wow, right? And then, using that intellectual power that they have, they might discover rationally a way to get into moral thinking that was not as that kind of compensates for deficient moral intuitions. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but I don't think it's preposterous, right? So something like that might be the case. Epiphenomenalist, you might think, look, maybe the background similarity assumption doesn't work there. Maybe people who have strong opinions about vegetarianism are more likely to become ethicists, right? So it's not that studying And that's before they even did any philosophical thinking really about it, right? They're just like, oh, they're 8-year-olds, oh, poor Bambi, right? So they're not going to eat burgers, right? Those people might be more likely to become ethicists. So we could save boosterism or phenomenalism by jettisoning one of the background assumptions, and I think that's not implausible. Now, against the rationalization view, right, rationalization view would predict that ethicists would show greater attitude-behavior consistency because they would have thought about ethical issues and beaten their moral opinions to match their behavior, more than people who hadn't thought as much about those ethical issues. But that's not what we see overall. The inert discovery view might work. So ethicists had more stringent views about charity, vegetarianism, and organ and blood donation if, and I mean this really as a hypothetical, I'm not committing to these, but if those are in fact the moral truth, then that would be a trend toward truth. By doing ethics, you discover, well, you know what, we do have, it is bad to eat meat. We do have an obligation to donate large amounts to famine relief, etc. But then they don't put it into action, right? So that would be, that's consistent with the data. I think another possibility that I've recently been attracted to is the idea that people aim toward moral mediocrity. That when we look out at the world, it's not like we want to be saints. What we want to be is like, you know, about as morally good as our neighbors, maybe not a whole lot, maybe a little morally better than our neighbors, you know, so we can feel a little superior, but not a whole lot, right? Think about, like, just to get your mind into this, right? So you're in a big classroom, and you find 10% of the people are cheating on the test and they're going to get A's. Like now you think, well, you know, maybe I should cheat too. Now you still think it's morally bad, but you know, it's like, I don't want to be the one honest person in the room and get a bad grade as a result. So like you bump that up from, you know, if 10% doesn't do for you, do 50%, right? Or, you know, maybe, what, there's even just the one guy over there in the corner in the class of 400, maybe you know, so that's one way of thinking about the situation of being tempted to behave morally badly because other people around you are, even if the other people who are behaving morally badly are a non-majority. So one possibility is that we use ethics to help us aim more accurately toward the particular level of moral mediocrity toward which we aspire. That would be kind of interesting, if a little depressing. No, I guess that'll do. Thank you.